And I'd like to contribute my little piece here, and I would like to start like John did by saying that I'm not a communication scholar per se. I'm in information studies. It's a parent discipline. We have a lot of cross-pollination between the two, but we also have different traditions, and I'll talk to you a little bit about where we are coming from. As you can see, I'm interested in the issues of information control and the politics of forgetting after 9/11. I'm currently writing a book on this topic. And I'll give you a brief overview of the research, but really I'm trying to, well, I'll try to tie up with some of my colleagues' next topics. So in other words, it's not exactly about the research, about the book's research right now, but it's really more about the politics of forgetting, the politics of truth. And a couple of weeks ago, as you can see from the slide, the students in our Faculty of Information at the University of Toronto housed this graduate student conference, which was called Housing Memory. And it was a 2-day-long journey, really, around issues of remembering and forgetting, about memory, archives, and records. And as I returned to my own research on information and access post 9/11, these themes really kept haunting me. Like remembering, forgetting is not a neutral process. And it begs us in some way to ask questions about the relations between power and knowledge production. And also who gets to decide what is worth forgetting and what is worth preserving and recording and for whom. What are the processes that, that can put records or evidence into oblivion? Are there instances when it is actually justifiable for institutions of memory like libraries and archives and museums to obliterate records in the name maybe of national security or any other purpose, or the public interest even? We have seen the archives in Canada and sometimes in the US here being requested to get rid of particular documents or records that have some national security implications. We've seen libraries in the US after the Patriot Act was implemented, especially Section 215, being willingly deciding to get rid of a patron's record or computer transaction logs because they didn't want to give it to law enforcement agencies. And then there are categories for representing records or information. We have seen in the US how we have new categories for calling information, like sensitive but unclassified information, critical information, and so on. So increasingly there's categories, that there's a new language to talk about records and information. Just in the category of sensitive but unclassified information, we have over 40 labels that are trying to kind of deconstruct the differences between all of these kinds of information. And in the process, what we get is kind of a misrepresentation or misinformation of what is actually, of the content and what is actually being sought to protect. So through this misrepresentation, there's an attempt to create almost deterrent to accessing those particular record or that information. So the overall message that we're getting from that is we don't want you to actually access that information. We'll find every way possible to kind of making sure that it is not easily available to the public. We have seen in the past couple of months and few years leaked memos from the White House about why and how the decision-making process was so secretive and under the Bush administrations. Republicans were trying to do everything under the radar as a means to get away from documenting the process, and again, kind of trying to use records for an alleged history instead of really another kind of history. So recreating history in ways that were interesting. So what or whose collective responsibility is it to document this state of affairs? Is it the news media, which have been the traditional watchdogs of the government, supplemented today by digital media? And yesterday with Professor Wasko, we talked about entertainment. What does the entertainment industry has to add to our understanding of history and what happened? We also have a reconceiving of the archives, the libraries, the museum, all these so-called cultural institutions, and their associated professions, especially the realization that libraries and archives are political. They are not neutral. Whatever you decide to select, to keep or not to keep, is also an act in and of itself. So what we have is this cultural institution have this tension between the duty of memory, like what is worth preserving and recording and keeping and for whom, but also a burden of care. If you want to, you have to preserve all these records that you are enabling access to, and who is going to do that and for how long and under what conditions and so on. So all this kind of leads me to this whole social life of information or of records. And there's a whole book called The Social Life of Information, which I would recommend. So tracing, my goal is to see how through the tracing of record, we try to not forget. We try to make sure that history is not forgotten. So I'm going to talk today about the relationship between records and memory and how this can become a past that defines us as well. So this was kind of the short version of the whole talk. So after that, you can disconnect now and just move on. But this is just a brief summary of my research, which will be coming in the book, which is looking at how anti-terrorism legislation have actually, and other policies and practices resulting from 9/11 have affected access to information, the public's right to know, but the whole information life cycle as well. And I'm looking at attempts to uncover examples of systemic and infrastructural barriers to transparency and accountability. And also kind of following on this morning's panel, looking at lessons on unintended consequences of looking at policy and intervention when we don't take into account the broader socio-political and cultural context of the distribution and the use and the production of information. So, as I said earlier, as means of introduction, I come from information studies. My faculty, the Faculty of Information, basically has, among its aim, it's a professional school. We train people to do something very simple in some way. We teach our students to help people to find stuff. Okay? And the stuff is materials, documents, resources, information, whatever you want to call it. So the institutions and the profession that are represented in our faculty, which has libraries, archives, museums, information systems and design, are all about preserving and ensuring that people have continued access to information and the information that they need for research, for decision making, and so on. Why do we care? Because, as you know here, in most Western democracies, free flow of information enables democracy, enables democracy, but enables discourse, enables exchange and democratic deliberation. It is an essential element to an open government and a working democracy. So what tools do we have at our disposal? As you can see here, we have depository libraries of government publications. We have, in the US, you have presidential libraries and archives that also collects all the records that presidents have used to make decisions while they were on power. We have national libraries. But increasingly, we have now websites for various government agencies and departments that provide in-depth resources and materials, and even are increasingly places for discussion and engagement. And the Obama administration is a good example of the use of these online places for not only informing, but also involving people, as Leah Levre would say. Then, in addition to that, we have pieces of legislation that, like Freedom of Information Act or Access to Information Act, that really enable people, the public, to have access to the inner workings of government. And I'll come back to those in a minute. However, since 9/11, we have seen some interesting changes in terms of what information institutions were or were not able to do. And some of it was very much reminding of under the McCarthy era, where information institutions, in this case libraries, because of that Section 215 that I mentioned of the Patriot Act, which what the Section 215 was saying is that it enabled law enforcement agencies to access so-called tangible records, which could include the patron's borrowing records, or your record of what you purchased at bookstores and so on. And because of that, it really forced information institutions and information professionals to creatively think about ways to inform the public about the fact that law enforcement agencies could have access to some of their information, personal information, which usually libraries just don't give away. So as you can see, by just saying that, anyway, these are just examples of creative ways in which those institutions were able to actually let the people know about what was going on in not so overt ways. In addition to Section 215 and other policies and practices that resulted from 9/11, we have seen documented evidence of thousands of documents being removed from federal and government websites in the years immediately following 9/11 events. Some of the data being removed seemed reasonable at the times in light of national security, but a lot of other information and documents wasn't really clear that it was warranted that they be removed. In addition, what we see is journalists and editors were also impacted by all kinds of changes. We had leaks. For example, there was possible prosecution for publishing classified information. In the US, you had the APAC in 2006, when you had the prosecution of 2 former lobbyists from the American Israel Public Affairs Committee for receiving and transmitting classified information they had received from a Department of Defense officials. That person was found guilty and sentenced to 12 years in prison. There's a problem of whistleblowers with increased pressure put on journalists to reveal their sources. Court closures were also something that were viewed as a way to undermine the public interest. And there was restricted access to material because of the limitations on access to information. So what we found is both in the US and in Canada, and I'm going to talk about these 2 countries mostly today, the access to information, the public's right to know, was almost threatened in different ways. And in Canada, one example illustrates this problem that I'm talking about, and it's the Juliette O'Neill case, which is linked to another very publicized and very disturbing case, which is the Maher Arar affair, which some of you may have heard of. And the Maher Arar affair has come to symbolize the problem with post-9/11 practices, extraordinary rendition, secret evidence, secrecy, information sharing between governments, persecution of journalists, lack of transparency and accountability, definition of an enemy or terrorist. All these issues were really came together in a very meaningful way. So let's quickly take a look at the example of Juliette O'Neill. She's a reporter for a Canadian newspaper, the Ottawa Citizen. And on January 21st, 2004, O'Neill obtained some privileged documents related to the Maher Arar case. So in response, the equivalent of our FBI, which is the RCMP, raided her house as part of an attempt to identify the leak. The raid seized notebooks, files, hard drive, and other materials. So the Attorney General of Canada argued in the Juliette O'Neill case that journalists who come in possession of any information not disclosable under the Access to Information Act are at risk of being thrown in jail. So an inquest took place, and in 2004, the Ontario Super Court judge, Lynn Ratushny, ruled that the sealing of those search warrants wasn't acceptable. And she states that it violated the constitutional guarantees of a free press, freedom of expression, and the public's right to an open court system. And eventually, that particular section of the Security of Information Act in Canada was actually was ruled unconstitutional, and the possessions of O'Neill were returned to her. So this leads me to the Maher Arar affair. Maher Arar is a telecommunications engineer who lives in Canada. He holds both citizenship, Syrian and Canadian. And he was deported to Syria and tortured in an apparent example of the United States policy of extraordinary rendition. So I'm going to kind of go briefly over the details. I can answer questions. Some of you may be familiar with his story. But the Canadian government ordered a commission of inquiry which concluded that he was indeed, that Maher Arar, it was indeed torture based upon interviews with him and others, that his statements were not taken under oath, and that the standards set down by the Istanbul Protocol for determining the effects of torture were not used. So the Commission of Inquiry publicly cleared Arar of any links to terrorism and gave him a $10.5 million settlement. The US government, however, refuses to clear Arar's name and maintains both him and his family on a watch list. And his US lawyers are currently pursuing the case, which is Arar versus Ashcroft, and they're seeking compensatory damage and so on and so forth. So Arar's story, Arar's case is not an isolated example. There are many Arars out there in some way. There are also many issues that need to be examined with regard to how we envisioned this war on terror and how it is to be conducted. For example, who is the enemy in this new war? How do we define a terrorist or a terrorist activity for that matter? Is a librarian who provides information to somebody about a particular place or particular subject, could he be considered to be kind of accomplice in this terrorist activity? Are the provisions to protect other civil and human rights, such as freedom of information, right of assembly, right of association, going to be threatened? For example, in terms of charity, there are a number of organizations that are listed as having some terrorist links. And what's interesting to know is that in Islam, for example, where it is it's part of the 5 pillars to give charity, it leads to a very big problem for many Muslims, because by religious law, in some way, they have to give charity. But then they just don't know where to give it because they don't have access to the proper information to make an informed decision that will not make them look like terrorists. And what's interesting is I was teaching an information policy course last year, and I put together a round table with a Muslim lawyer, a member of the RCMP who was nice enough to come and talk about the topic. And it was interesting, the miscommunication that existed, because the RCMP official at that time wasn't even aware about the fact that charity was such an important aspect of that religion, which is often kind of talked about when we talk about funding or sponsoring terrorist activities. So it's interesting. So to kind of move on really quickly, because I have like 3 minutes, what was interesting about what Canada and US and many of the governments after 9/11 were under pressure to do is to be seen as acting. And that was something that really kind of explains why so many of the legislation that were passed were actually had so many problems, were not very well thought through, because there was a time when being seen to act was essential in many ways. These are just examples of the many legislations that were passed. But what I wanted to point out also is that a central theme of this whole anti-terrorism legislation and the climate post 9/11 was the logic of risk management, risk prevention was a major impetus for action. It's the equivalent of the orange color coding, that you have here, and that people are fascinated with outside of the US, that you have orange and yellow and anyway. So these are examples of initiatives that were taken very shortly after 2001. In terms of defining terrorism, I won't go into that, just to say that, I don't know if you're aware of that, but there's no agreed upon definition of terrorism. And this is an example of the UN Human Rights Committee, who really came down very strongly on the UK's definition of terrorism, which says it's way too narrow, and it creates a bunch of different issues that one has to deal with. What I really wanted to point out is that in terms of information, there has been a huge war around control over information, and this has taken many forms. Many of it was just to unplug information purely and simply. And there are many sites like this one from Electronic Frontier Foundation that was able to track for the period between 2001 and 2004 all the websites that were shut down, either by government, by ISPs, and so on and so forth. It's a really wonderful archives that we have left of everything that doesn't exist anymore in some way. There were untold amounts of information that were removed from agency websites, and these are just a few examples here. I'm going to go really briefly over that, but in terms of even the scientific and the publishing world, there have been a lot of interesting ramification of this control, this attempt to controlling information, whether it is what has been published or who can be invited or not. This is for those of you who know Tariq Ramadan, who is a very well-known Islam scholar from Switzerland. He was given a tenure-track position at Notre Dame, but an official from Homeland Security decided that because of his connection, he just couldn't be allowed to enter. As a result, he's now at the London School of Economics, doing some really interesting work about and he was invited under the Clinton administration to the White House, so it's really interesting. Donating charity, as I meant, protesting is also something that might be viewed as problematic under those conditions. No time for Canada or for the US, other than saying that there was a lot of interesting policies that went, that took place, and a lot of decisions were made by the Bush administration that it would be very interesting for me to see what Obama can undo and whether it is even possible or it is willingness even to do that. But the questions that I wanted us to ponder on is really around using national security as this trump card for a number of different issues, including what laws you pass, what you override versus what you balance, and even also kind of the implications of looking at intentions over actions, or using suspicions as kind of the first line of defense. Like you are, it's your responsibility as an individual to prove your normalcy, right? Because you're suspicious right away. And looking at how information sharing has, between government agencies, between governments, has allowed for this profiling of people. Because of technology also, profiling is very, very popular. If you're in any way doing nice categories and labeling, you can get a lot of money from NSF and from many funding agencies because they want to be able to kind of categorize and put people in nicely labeled boxes and doing inferences based on tracking your pattern, the data. I talked a little bit about sensitive but unclassified information. I just want to link with the previous panel by saying that the relationship between the individual and the state is what I wanted to close with, is really interesting. Because in addition to these logics of risk that I mentioned, there's also an interesting nexus that we're seeing happening, a nexus between security, democracy, and technology, where technology is really kind of becoming part of the decision making, and policing and security are becoming kind of almost a standard for administrative decision-making. Surveillance, it's a whole other ball game. But technologically mediated legal environments are increasingly being not only developed in North America, but trying to be exported in other countries. That's what we call policy laundering, where many countries who have a very different legislative framework are actually implementing policies and ideas when the socio-political and cultural context is really quite different. Transnational efforts, we mentioned that a little bit in the morning, but I think it's really important to keep in mind that there are issues of national sovereignty that are touched when you kind of bring this transnational effort. And I know in Canada in particular, there's a lot of resistance increasingly towards kind of adopting these agreements with the US. And just to finish, I think all I wanted to add is the last point, which is that perhaps because of the event that happened, perhaps of just the ramification of many of the decisions and policies and practices that have been adopted, we have forgotten to take time and reflect on what happened before taking action. And this is what Laura Donoghue called fostering a culture of restraint, like maybe kind of backing up and really thinking about what we are doing to ourselves, to the public's right to know, and to freedom of expression more generally, and our responsibility as professional, as institution in the process. So I'll leave you with that. Thank you.